All right, thanks for joining me. I'm John Bryan, and this is Freedom is Scary, episode number 74. And this is about employer mandate options. And I have with me here attorneys Chris Wiest and Andy Fox. We'll waste no time, and I'll go ahead and bring them on. Good afternoon.
Hey guys.
All right, so in the middle here, that's Chris Wiest, and he's an attorney out of Kentucky. And on the right here is Andy Fox, and he's out of Tennessee. And I know that we've all been getting a flood of communications, whether via telephone, email, social media, in response to all of the employer vaccine mandate shenanigans.
Right.
And I've had both you guys on before. We've discussed various things, I think, including this stuff. But I know that both of you guys have been working on this issue, and we're all in different states. So, I think, wherever you guys want to start, kind of what I wanted to go over is, and I think people's questions really are what are our legal options at this point? And I know, Chris, that you've already done a webinar on this, and you've been over it ad nauseum. So maybe you want to start off. How do you want to begin?
Yeah, and I've been kind of doing. I stumbled into a vaccine rights case, which was actually a religious liberty case for a private Catholic high school in northern Kentucky 2 years ago, and that involved some government mandates and some constitutional claims because it was government mandates. And I got introduced to a law firm that's known as Siri Glimstad, and Siri does the legal work for ICANN. He's got a boutique, basically, vaccine rights practice for the Informed Consent Action Network. And I mean, he's probably, I would say, everybody points to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but I would say Aaron Siri is probably one of the biggest, foremost experts on vaccine rights work in the country. And in fact, I've been doing some constitutional cases with him. Pro hoc vice, we filed a lawsuit in the DC District Court and federal court in DC. DC had a law that we're challenging that allows 11-year-olds to get vaccines without their parents' knowledge or consent. And in fact, there's an entire statutory scheme to hide it from the parents. And so we challenged that. We just filed a lawsuit last week in California for a medical professor who's got natural immunity against the Board of Regents of the University of California medical system. And we just did a pertussis vaccine rights case for a young lady. Those are interesting because they're against government actors. And so obviously the Constitution applies to government actors. And generally when I give people bad news about employer vaccine mandates, the first thing I hear out of their mouth is, well, the Constitution protects me and the Constitution protects my rights. And I'm like, well, do you have a government employer? No, I have a private employer. Well, the Constitution doesn't protect you against your private employer. And I don't, I'd be interesting if you guys have other thoughts on this, but I begin with sort of disabusing people of that notion that the Constitution does not apply unless it's a government employer or some government mandate that's driving it. And then, then I look to state law. I mean, and I don't know what West Virginia and Tennessee's got, but I can speak to Ohio and Kentucky, where I've got, where I practice on both sides of the river. I'm up in the northern part of Kentucky, so I kind of practice in both states. Some state laws and statutes provide more protection. And then, absent that, there's sort of, at least in my view, the religious exemption under Title VII, maybe because that gets into weighing of burdens and employer burdens, and a medical exemption possibly under the Americans with Disabilities Act if you qualify. And that's about all the people really have. And a lot of folks don't realize that. There was a guy up here in northern Kentucky that filed a lawsuit and alleging constitutional violations by private employers recently. And I looked at that lawsuit and I'm like, I know where that's going. That's going to get dismissed. But I don't know what your guys' thoughts are. I mean, that's kind of what I'm seeing. And I'm trying to point people towards the two, what I consider viable options, either a medical exemption with a doctor's note and a possible ADA claim, or, a religious exemption under Title VII. And we all know that that's not as clear cut as we would like it to be.
Yeah. I mean, my conclusion has been that, and I still do have a private employer mandate challenge that's pending in the Southern District of West Virginia, but that was based on the EUA status, and that is basically seeking, retroactive relief, so damages for a wrongful termination that took place in the past, with an employer who sort of jumped the gun here. So it won't necessarily affect people who are still at their jobs, even if I were to win it, still at their jobs. I think it's been my conclusion as well that really, there's probably not going to be a litigation route to avoid to keep your job here, or even to get damages. That probably the best route is either the health exemption or the religion exemption. That's sort of the direction I've been pointing people. And I think one question people have is, and particularly on the health exemption, is, well, what if I've already had COVID, and I have natural immunity? Isn't that a health reason? Isn't that a good reason to not get vaccinated? And in fact, there was just a article up on the Blaze here, today, I believe, or yesterday, by Daniel Horowitz, that list 15 different studies so far that have indicated that people who have natural immunity from having gotten the disease already have advantages to people who have already taken the vaccines. And even the CDC admitted just on August 18th, Walensky said, and even though our vaccines are currently working well to prevent hospitalizations, we're seeing concerning evidence of waning vaccine effectiveness over time and against the Delta variant. So, I mean, if that's true, if there's waning, effectiveness of the vaccine, and it's less effective than the natural immunity one would have, I mean, that seems like a pretty good basis for trying to get out of taking the vaccine. But I just throw that out there.
So you got to find a doctor that's willing to write a note that would say, one, that those studies are accurate and that, it's the same. And two, I think you've got to go further to trigger the ADA, that because of the prior infection, getting the vaccine, provides some sort of health risk to you. I mean, there are some doctors that are saying that. I just think the employee's got to document it to sort of ripen the claim and give that to the employer and ask for, the accommodation.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of been the problem with kids in schools and the masks. So, I mean, for instance, I've talked to a lot of people. One in particular, for example, the young child has asthma, diagnosed with asthma, no dispute over that. Was forced to wear a mask all last year during school when they were in school, and as a result of that, the asthma started to get worse. Whereas it had been improving as the child got older. Now it started to get worse. And so this year they're gonna mandate masks, and the mom goes to the school and asks for a health exemption based on this diagnosis of asthma and these clear problems that are actually occurring. And the school just says, nope, you only with a doctor's note. So as it has been happening, they go to the child's pediatrician and they're like, no, we're not giving any opinion on masks. And that's just disgusting, I think. But that's what's happened, is all the medical community, it seems like, is just in lockstep, that they're not, whether due to fear or ignorance, they're not going to, even to protect like this one child with asthma from having to suffer in his mask needlessly, they're not willing to go out on any limbs whatsoever, even for their patients.
So, I've had some doctors contact me that have been writing notes on vaccine exemptions and mask exemptions. And what we're seeing, at least what I'm seeing in Kentucky, is individuals reporting them to the medical board in sort of retaliation of that. Now we're getting into possible government action and the possibility of a government lawsuit. But I've got these two cases out in California. One is actually, I don't know if you guys know what pertussis is. It's a bacteria. It's an infection. This gal, the client of ours, got a Tdap when she was young, had a extraordinary adverse reaction. California actually changed their medical exemption laws to where, like, every single time a doctor writes a medical exemption for a student for any vaccine, it gets directly reviewed by the medical board. And like, there's the most threatening sort of, we're going to yank your license if you write this scheme that's going on in California right now. It's part of the pertussis lawsuit we filed last week. I mean, I think, the big hospitals that don't like these exemptions, the big school districts that don't like these exemptions, they're going to turn the docs into the medical board. And, I mean, it's a tough place. And generally, the only doctors I'm finding that are willing to write are people with, I got to get a lady here in Kentucky. She's got impeccable credentials. She used to work for Fauci. You're probably aware of her. She was my expert in the mask mandate case. And she's got an independent private practice. And she's like, let them go after me. I testify in front of the medical board as an expert frequently. Let them yank my license. I can back this up with studies, and I'm willing to defend it.
Was she's that willing to Rutherford?
It was Rutherford.
Dr.
She's willing to go to the mat. A lot of docs are not willing to incur that kind of fight. And that's part of the problem.
Is pertussis whooping cough? Is that?
Yeah. What's been going on in Tennessee, Andy?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm getting lots of calls, people from Nashville that can't find a lawyer to help them in Nashville. And I'm not sure I can help them, for the same reasons that you all are explaining, that you feel very restricted in what remedies you can offer people. Of course, Tennessee has a pretty strong RFRA statute with regard to government employers. But on the other hand, they've already passed a law that says that government employers can't require vaccines. That does, though, go towards mask requirements. And for instance, University of Tennessee is requiring masks for faculty and students. And I have one of each who'd like to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit against Tennessee over the mask situation. And I did want to just throw this out there. I'm looking for like anything. And you're talking, John, about the EUA. I actually did a lot of research beyond just the emergency use authorization provision of the Food and Drug Act or whatever it is. But I looked based upon that memo that was released by the Office of Legal Counsel. They actually, it was helpful for me because they laid out a lot of the statutes that they were relying upon, or that kind of set the framework for, the EUA and approvals and all that. And I think it's 21 USC 330, Section 330, Section 331 lays out what the prohibited acts are for anyone. It's prohibited to introduce or deliver for introduction into commerce anything that's in violation of, all these different statutes, one of which is the EUA. And, I thought to myself, hey, I bet that the feds interpret introduce into commerce in an incredibly broad way, because, you got these U.S. attorneys and FDA lawyers who are trying to snag anybody. And so it's going to be really, really broad what they consider introduction into commerce. And in fact, I looked at some administrative decisions, and people are pleading guilty to indirectly introducing something into commerce, or conspiracy to introduce something into commerce, or even promoting something to be introduced into commerce. They'll like lose their license to prescribe drugs and things like that, or to be a sales drug rep. Apparently, I didn't know you had to be licensed for that, but apparently you do. So anyways, it seems like if somebody is insisting on you getting a vaccine in violation of the EUA, that's a prohibited act. Because what you're doing is you're indirectly forcing the introduction into commerce in violation of the EUA. And if even conspiracy is enough to violate that statute, would that be a basis for seeking, like an injunction against somebody before they're fired? I know, John, your case is, hey, this guy got fired because he wasn't given an option like he was supposed to. But what about actually restraining somebody from even putting you in that provision? The only thing it comes down to is is there a private right of action created by the EUA? What do y'all think about that?
And we've done that research, obviously. Siri's done that research, and the answer is that there is no private right of action for that. What I looked at, I think John actually brought this claim, but I analyzed it under Kentucky law. Kentucky recognizes a discharge in violation of public policy, and Kentucky Supreme Court has set out some elements for that. Ohio's got a similar cause of action. And if you think about it, and is it a violation of clearly defined statutory law? Yes. I mean, it's so, sort of using that state law cause of action, I think could give rise. The problem, and I think John just pointed this out, and this is the real issue, the EUA statute is done and gone with respect to the Pfizer vaccine as of like 3 days ago with the full approval. And now, there's this, they've got this full approval. And so I think, that's the problem. And so now I'm back to, well, that cause of action, because when I did a webinar and I put a memo out, that was one of the 3 outs was, hey, it's an EUA, there's a public policy discharge, violation of public policy in Kentucky. I think that's gone. I think the first route is gone. And now I'm back to, we're looking at medical and we're looking at religious, particularly for private employers. Public employers, Constitution applies. We're starting to litigate those claims. I hate those claims in the hospital setting. Like, you talk about the worst test case ever. It would be a vaccine mandate in a hospital setting, in the sense of like, bad facts make bad law. Well, what judge is going to say a hospital can't mandate a vaccine, because that's where people are being treated? I hate that as a claim, not so much on the law, because the law is the same everywhere if you had a government a hospital, but like, I hate it from the facts. If I'm going to do a test case, I don't want to start with the hardest case. I want to start with, and actually where we started was California. We just filed it. Someone who's had COVID, natural immunity. We've got the studies. We've got 3 expert declarations. Public government employer. It's the University of California system. I know we're going up through the 9th Circuit, so we're probably not going to get a lot of love there. But actually, not to get into our legal strategy, but we're intending to bring like 6 or 7 test cases around the country. Siri's got the clients through ICANN to do it. And we're going to try and create a circuit split, get some federal circuit to bite, and then try and take this to the Supreme Court to recognize basically under the Roe progeny, right? If a woman's got a right to choose an abortion, clearly how in the heck is this invasive medical procedure not sort of the same thing under Cruzan? And so we wanted to start with the government sort of first from the constitutional standpoint. But private employers, man, I mean, I'm like Title VII, religious freedom, maybe, and medical, if you can get a doctor's note, ADA, that's the only thing I can come up with that seems to be viable.
Yeah. So what do you think the ideal plaintiff here is? A public employee in a non-healthcare setting who has natural immunity from prior infection?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes. Right? Because what's the governmental interest then in enforcing a vaccine on somebody that's already immune, right? They got to come up with some governmental interest, to warrant that sort of intrusion. What are they going to say? I mean, I guess you could get into a bench trial on the efficacy of natural immunity versus a vaccine. We probably will end up doing that at some point. But yes, I think that is the test case, John, at least from my perspective, and at least from our perspective. And we've already started bringing those cases.
I get this question a lot on the religious exemption side. If someone's going to claim a religious exemption, I know one of the reasons that have been used is because I guess fetal stem cells were used in the development of the COVID vaccines, but weren't they also used in other vaccines that people potentially claiming this religious exception? They're going to have to answer the question potentially. Well, did you have these other vaccines that also used fetal stem cells? Have you looked into that at all? How I first got involved with Siri in 2019 was the varicella chickenpox vaccine in a private Catholic high school, in which 80% of them were aware that it contained aborted fetal cells, actually in the production, not only in the development. And they all objected to it on that basis. Obviously, chickenpox, a little less lethal, way less lethal than COVID. And we actually brought a religious freedom case. But yeah, that
that is a basis of objection. And generally speaking, the way that people I've talked to answer that question is, I wasn't aware when I received these prior vaccines that they contained this morally illicit product in my view. And now that I'm aware, I object generally. Yeah, that seems to be the answer to the what I would call the inconsistency issue that you've raised.
Yeah, I mean it's just bizarre or ironic that like you're not allowed to have an exemption from taking it based on just making a rational healthcare decision for your choice or for yourself. For instance, I believe based on my research and that I have, my greater natural immunity is better for me healthcare wise than getting a vaccine, which will not be better for me. Just a basic. You're not allowed to make just a basic rational decision that's protected under the law, but you can make potentially an irrational decision that you subscribe to a certain religious view that that dictates and subjectively in your mind that you shouldn't take the vaccine. But I mean that's how it is. We're all, I guess we always have to tie something to religion to get greater protection here, but it just seems backwards.
I do what I find interesting, and I'd love you guys to respond to this, but if an employer can mandate a medical procedure, i.e., a vaccine, right? If an employer is able to do that as a matter of public policy, and by the way, I think courts are generally going to say that they can, absent maybe the religion or a medical issue with it. Wants to keep an employer from saying, look, I don't want anyone to any married couple, any non-married couple, I don't want any employee the father or be the parent of a child. You can't get pregnant. You can't do any of that while you're employed here. Pregnancy and parenthood, they all detract from my mission of making sure people are available and working hard. I don't want anybody distracted by kids. That's my employer interest. I mean, if you think about it, what is to keep people from sort of mandating sterilization, right? What's to keep a private employer, from mandating sterilization as a condition of employment? And if you're going to say that, well, the vaccine, is the employer has an interest in the vaccine, then why not go all the way and say that the employer has the right to condition employment on sterilization? And nobody ever seems to have a good answer for that when I raise that as an issue.
Yeah, I went into some of the sterilization cases in my response brief and my case that's now pending. And another, people are surprised to learn that our government has attempted to sterilize citizens in the past, including prisoners and so on. But I found this other really awful case that actually came out of West Virginia that I had cited in my last brief. I had never heard of this, but West Virginia or the government, they were injecting radiation into primarily African American cancer patients without their consent or even knowledge. The government was doing that in West Virginia. And then there was a lawsuit, and then there was a court order that came out of it that I thought was helpful, that had language that stood for the proposition that, like, no, you have this right to, bodily integrity, and the government is not allowed to, inject some harmful foreign substance in your body without your consent. And that's basically a very similar issue that we're dealing with here.
Well, it is and it's not, right? Because it's not the government, it's at-will employment. I'm guessing you guys are also at-will states, Ohio and Kentucky is. And the rub is getting a court to recognize as some sort of public policy, possibly that it is against the state's public policy to have an employer mandate a medical procedure on an employee. At some point I'd love to see that. And maybe that's another argument. It's untested. There's no case law I've seen that supports it, but maybe, these are weird times. Maybe we get somebody to adopt it. Generally, I find that the judges are sort of pro-government, pro-vaccine, generally speaking. And so I'm not sure that there's an appetite for it. But, we're looking in Kentucky, all the hospitals mandated it. And I think I heard we've already got a shortage, not because of bed space, not because of, we're in a COVID surge, and I think you guys maybe as well, but because of staffing. And so we've already got a staffing shortage. Now they're talking about laying off 30% of the hospital workforce. mostly nursing, because they don't want to get the vaccine, and we're going to lay them off in the middle of a surge. And I'm like, I'm not sure you guys really want to do this. But, that I don't know what you guys think. I mean, I'm not sure what other angles there may be on this.
Well,
I mean, and Andy, I was all with you on the EUA until they approved the Pfizer vaccine this week.
Well, I heard that some of the Pfizer supply is EUA still and some isn't. Like, maybe you can go into that more, but not all the Pfizer supply is actually approved. Some of it's still EUA, and it has
No,
to
that's
do
right.
with Pfizer was manufacturing Comirnaty, but another company's vaccine, and some of what they manufactured is approved. I guess that's the best way I can explain it.
Yeah, the Pfizer Biotech, I think it's Pfizer Biotech. I'm probably not getting that right. That's still EUA, and then they've got a new name. You mentioned it. It's like Comirnaty. That's under the full approval. I mean, I think honestly, I think if an employee said, I will get the fully approved one when it's available, I doubt an employer is going to be able to, get away with firing an employee that took that position. But generally what I'm seeing is, I mean, people are either going to do it or they're not.
Andy, did you say that in Tennessee, you guys now have legislation prohibiting private employer vaccine mandates?
No, public employer.
Public employee. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, as with all of this fascism that we fought against for the past year and a half, I think the unfortunate truth is that it's just extremely unlikely to get that you're ever going to get the courts to stop it. I mean, I think the sad fact is that the government can basically do anything they want to us anytime they want. And I mean, and hell, if the government can do that, then private employers can probably do more. But what power do we have? I mean, the best power that we have is our republic, our representative form of government. So our state legislatures. I mean, that's really the answer. Is the West Virginia legislature, the Kentucky legislature can pass legislation that says private employers cannot mandate COVID vaccines, and I think that would be ideal. That's something we can work with.
Did the NAACP, when they first started fighting for equal civil rights in the courts, like Thurgood Marshall, did they have other claims besides constitutional claims? Did they have any kind of like antitrust claims? I mean, it occurred to me if everybody gets, if every private company blocks people out, like from a consumer aspect or something, could an antitrust claim be litigated? I'm just trying to be as creative as possible, and throw stuff out there for fodder, because like you guys, I'm coming up short.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to have any litigation strategy against the private employer is going to have to get creative and engage in a little bit of legal acrobatics here. I don't know. I think potentially anything's could work. I mean, probably none of it. I think until the legislatures step in, I think the courts, unless you find maybe a federal judge who's insulated from politics, appointed for life, who's willing to really go out on a limb.
Yeah, but look at the indicator there where you just had Justice Barrett deny the injunction pending appeal or the stay in the Indiana case. I mean, I don't think we're going to get a lot of love ultimately out of the federal judiciary on this. And to your point, I think you need statutes. I think Florida passed a vaccine passport. I think Montana did. We have a bill pending in Kentucky, a pre-filed bill. Obviously, our legislature doesn't meet till January. I mean, it's got about 19 co-sponsors. I could see it maybe getting up to about 25. It will not get passed because, the Chamber of Commerce is coming in trumpeting quote unquote employer freedom, the employer freedom to basically, force their employees into health decisions that they don't want. But I mean, the big bad chamber's coming in Kentucky. And I mean, this is the same group that's supporting the governor's mask mandates in schools. I mean, they're, big business isn't going to support a prohibition on them being able to, dictate to their employees. So I think you're running up against kind of the big business, chamber Republicans versus the Liberty Republicans, at least in Kentucky. And of course, what Democrat doesn't love, mandates for health procedures unless it involves abortion. So, I'm sitting here thinking we're probably not getting any love out of our legislature next session. I can't speak to West Virginia or Tennessee.
Yeah, we had a member of the House of Delegates that I just saw had at least started the process of introducing this sort of legislation. And again, our legislature meets in, I believe, January as well. But a lot of people, have already said, well, hell, I'll be fired by then. So, what good will that do me? And it's probably, if you don't have any faith that the Kentucky legislature will do it, then I know the West Virginia legislature won't, because ours wouldn't even restrict or limit our governor's emergency powers as he perceives them last legislative session, whereas yours did.
Ours overplayed his hands. Ours sent the state police into Baptist churches around the state on Easter Sunday, and honestly, that just started the firestorm. I think had he not done that, they would have given him a pretty long runway.
When is he up for re-election again?
23.
You think he'll win?
I think he's going to get crushed in one of the biggest resounding beatings ever. And there are some folks that generally support his COVID response, but again, that church thing, he just made a lot of people mad in a lot of rural parts of the state, and I don't think he's going to be able to overcome it. That was just an unforced error. So I think he's done.
As long as the vote counts don't go backwards on live TV.
We saw that before. Yeah. Andy, is Tennessee, do you think that your legislature's got any shot at, a vaccine passport prohibition or anything down there?
There was something, there was a bill filed like that, I believe, and it got watered down into just, the government restriction. But the legislature rattled its sabers over the past month or so, and they were going to call a special session. And it seemed Governor Lee issued a new executive order stating that parents could opt out of any mask requirement by like a local school district. So the the General Assembly is getting more active. They've been slow to act, but and there's a certain contingent that's more radical than others, in trying to get remedies for citizens. But we'll see. They may take it to the next level if the pressure comes from the citizens that they're not able to engage in commerce. Already, for instance, in Knoxville, the major live venues are saying, well, you got to either have a vaccine or a negative COVID test in order to patronize us. And, that may continue to grow. And if it does, who knows? The mask opposition eventually got through to the legislature. It took a while, but, they've started to act now. I think maybe they're done with it.
It sounds like John and I may be moving to Tennessee.
Yeah. Kenneth here had a question, and somebody said this to me. A client of mine I was talking to today made this claim to me, and I said, well, I don't know if that's the case, but he says, my understanding is that the Pfizer vaccine is still under EUA, that the sister vaccine got approval, but it's not actually the same one. Do you guys know anything about that?
That's what we were talking about a second ago.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think there are some supplies of what I'm going to call the approved, but my understanding is they're in really, really short supply.
Okay, so here shortly, all of the EUA vaccines are gone. They're all going to be the approved version.
You know what's interesting about the EUA, and this is really for Moderna and J&J. The EUA statute said one of the thresholds for having an EUA is that there is not a fully approved alternative. Well, now there is a fully approved alternative. So what is this Pfizer approval going to do to the Moderna and J&J approvals under the EUA? I don't know. That's a question maybe, for a federal court, but I think that's interesting.
Well, yeah, it's a question for the federal court, but the federal court's going to say, but only the federal government can ask us that question. So we're not going to answer it unless the FDA wants to take it up and try to remove the EUA authorization for those other vaccines. So that's going to be we're back to the very same problem. Yeah, technically it's in violation of federal law, but only the FDA can enforce that federal law. So, too bad.
Has there actually been a case saying that about the EUA? Because you said there's no private right of action. Are you just going through the factors, or is there actually?
There was the Texas case. The Texas case where like the 100 and whatever nurses or hospital employees sued.
Mm-hmm.
That was the holding out of Texas was that was part of it is I think that the EUA is not privately enforceable, and I believe that's being appealed. And
but there's case law on that out of the DC Circuit, and I think the Second Circuit as well, which isn't helpful. That says the same thing.
Yeah, and I know that.
Right.
And I know there was a case. I think that law firm in New York had filed a case in North Carolina that the same issue was brought up and on a motion to dismiss, and they ended up withdrawing it rather than getting a ruling on it. But
and I talked about them with that, and we went back and forth, and we're like, do we really want to eat another bad ruling on this, create more adverse bad case law that we're going to have to later battle maybe? And when that sometimes you just don't want the ruling out there if you think you're going to lose, because it just makes it harder for the next case.
Yeah, and in my case, I guess my legal gymnastics theory is that I don't need it to be privately enforceable, because our West Virginia public policy exception just includes all federal law, including the FDA Act, and I don't need to enforce it directly. Just saying it's a violation of federal law. I mean, we'll see what the federal court does with it. But yeah, I think the point is that I don't think any of these are going anywhere, and it's all just coming down to either some sort of specific particularized health exception based on individual circumstances, or a religious exception based on individual circumstances. I mean, that it looks like those are really the only two realistic options here.
The other thing that I'm getting inquiries on, and like, I don't know about you guys, I'm getting like over 100 emails a day, multiple calls. Like, I'm not even, if I don't recognize a phone number, it's going to voicemail. But they're allowing a religious exemption, but they're requiring like weekly testing, mask wearing, and multiple penalties for sort of invoking it, right? I just saw Delta Airlines is increasing their employee health premium if you refuse to get vaccinated. And so what those are, I call those the vaccine penalty cases, but they're not necessarily discharges. And right now, I'm just telling people, look, I got people under mandates about to lose their job. Like, I'm not in a position to help you right now with your complaint about a mask mandate in your workplace, because, I mean, there's people that are frankly, that have professional licenses in hospitals that are about to lose their job over full-on mandates, or government employees in some cases. And so we're sort of, looking at that as sort of the more pressing issues versus dealing with somebody that's complaining about. And I'm not saying they don't have a legitimate complaint about an employer mask mandate if you don't get vaccinated. I'm just like, man, people are losing their jobs for not getting vaccinated. Just be glad that they're at least accommodating you to some degree, because some employers are not, and those are the bigger fights.
What do you think people need to know if they're gonna, for instance, go after a religious exemption? I know it's going to be different per employer, but how should they start off to try to get a religious exemption?
I mean, I would write the letter. Title VII protects religious beliefs and requires employers to offer reasonable accommodations for religious beliefs. I would start there. I would say I have a sincerely held religious belief against these COVID-19 vaccines. You pointed out the aborted fetal cells. That seems to be a pretty good one because it was derived from or used aborted fetal cells in the testing or development process. If they can cite some scripture, that's always helpful. I request that you reasonably accommodate my belief and allow me alternatives to the vaccine requirement. And again, if the employer comes back and says, well, sure, but you got to wear a mask, I'm telling people just to suck that up right now rather than losing your job.
Since you mentioned that, I actually I listened to Liberty Counsel. I don't know if you guys have checked that out. They have a very good webpage dedicated to COVID links, and they actually have a sample religious exemption letter, and they encourage use this as a template. I think Alliance Defending Freedom also has a religious exemption letter, but Liberty Counsel themselves are talking about masks as being an accommodation if you're opposing the vaccine. So, just what you were saying, Chris, the fighting the mask battle when you're fighting the vaccine battle and you're saying, oh yeah, you can at least wear a mask and that's what you ought to propose. It puts the mask battle to second tier, I guess.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I know people are mad about it. They view that as also an incursion on bodily integrity. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but if you work in certain industries, PPE has been required in a number of industries for years, right? Medical professionals have always had face masking requirements. You work in certain industries, factory settings, you may be wearing shields and masks anyways. The folks that are painting cars, they've got their mask to protect themselves. I'm not really interested in fighting those battles, particularly in a private employer space right now, because people are being forced to undergo medical procedures that they don't want to keep their jobs. And it seems to me like that's the bigger evil.
I'm reaching back to law school, but I remember, when I took the bar review course, they said, the 13th Amendment, maybe they said in law school too, but they said the 13th Amendment is the only amendment that applies to private actors. And now that's getting way out there. I remember, by the way, as a side note, at the bar review course, the guy said, if you get some question that's really weird and there's no obvious answer, but the 13th Amendment is one of them, then you need to select that one because that's the right answer. And I had one like that. I don't know if you guys did on the multi-state, but what about the 13th Amendment? What about, it's effectively slavery to force somebody to undergo a medical procedure in order to have a job, in order to work.
If I'm representing the employer, my response to that is I'm not forcing you to work without pay. I'm not forcing you to I am putting conditions of employment on, and you're free to walk out of this job at any point in time. I think that was the decision that the federal court made in the Houston hospital case. And I hear you on all those points. I mean, I don't disagree. I just think we're going to hear that right back that it's not. Title VII's a pretty decent angle on the religious freedom. And if you can get a doctor's note, then I think you're well within the ADA. You can get a doctor to write it without fear of the medical board. So at least I think that's what we're stuck with for now, unless we can get the Supreme Court to recognize some inherent right for your employer not to coerce you into undergoing medical procedures.
Yeah, or we're back to politics. It's just like with the school mask thing that I'm busy fighting right now. I just spoke at a school board meeting last night. That was a lot of fun. But what it comes down to is, you see the school board members come in and they're all, some of them former teachers, teachers union types. They got masks this big covering their face. They don't care what you say. There's nothing you can say. They don't even care if you're going to sue them because they're going to use your own money to fight you. The only thing that they respond to is political science, is losing their position. And I think that's really unfortunate. The answer to all this stuff, whether it's the vaccine mandates, either private or public employees, or school mask issues. It all comes down to you're just going to have to roll up your sleeves and get involved in politics and replace those commie school board members or replace those state legislators who refuse to rein in the governor and to represent you and be your voice. I mean, I think that's unfortunately just the answer, and it's not an easy answer because it's easy to get on social media and say, yeah, so and so should be primaried, whatever, but actually getting out there and making it happen, I think, is much more difficult task.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys have seen people have, I've said, look, you've got religious and medical, and that's all you've got. And people like want to go after me on social media, and they're like, I have rights and Nuremberg Code, and they go on and on and on. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. And a federal judge is going to recognize like none of that, religious or medical. And like, but I have rights. And I'm like, well, do you really have rights if the federal court's not going to recognize it? I don't know. I mean, so I mean, it's hard for people to hear this. Like, I think there's awakening going on that people, have been sleeping for a long time, right? They're living their lives. They're not paying attention to what's going on around them. Now, all of a sudden, their kids are being messed with in schools with mask mandates. Now, all of a sudden, their employer's saying they got to get a, medical procedure that they may not be sure of, that they're not sure wasn't fast-tracked, that they're not sure about long-term effects. And, people are now waking up and they're like, well, I thought these like legislators and like these elected judges were like supposed to protect me. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't really work like that. Like they'll protect you if you're loud enough. They'll protect you if you make enough campaign donations. And if not, you got to throw them out of office. So, I mean, that's what I've been telling people.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time here, but what is the route for people if they're claiming a religious exemption, or even, well, let's just stick with religious. If they're claiming a religious exemption, say maybe they fill out whatever their employer requires. Maybe they fill out a form, they write a letter, whatever. And what if the employer says, no, we don't recognize that? What is their remedy?
So let's assume that they've got 15 or more employees, right? Because that's a trigger for Title VII. If they're under 15, you're just out of luck unless state law provides something. But assume that they've got more than 15. I think then you could file a charge with the EEOC and ultimately bring a case in federal court on that issue. And, I urge people as they write this to offer accommodations to the employers, alternatives, whether it's, as much as people scream at me, I'm like, maybe you offer masks, maybe you offer that you'll get tested once a week, for COVID testing. There's now rapid testing that allows for that. You can buy it at Walgreens. It's $20 for 2 tests. Maybe you'll agree to that as, accommodation. But I find that generally speaking, like, I think you got to go the Title VII route and start to tee up those claims. And
then likewise for a health exemption, they then have to go the ADA route.
Right.
And that's also what, 15? Is it 15 or is it more employees that are required to trigger the ADA?
I don't think it's more for ADA. It's 15. I think it might be 8. It's 8 or 15. I don't recall off the top of my head.
I think it's another question that I'm sure you guys get a lot, but a question people have is, the issue of whether because the employers are pressuring them to quit. If you don't want to take the vaccine, we consider that you're voluntarily resigning. They're pressuring them to voluntarily resign. Should people go along with that? Should people quit, or should they make the employer fire them? This is rhetorical, I know, but
right. I'll let Andy answer this one first.
I think you let people fire you, but that's. I'd love to hear your answer.
No, you have to, because otherwise you're going to be arguing constructive discharge in the subsequent wrongful employment action. And that's never where you want to be. Make them fire you. If you quit, you're waiving your unemployment. You're probably waiving your rights under, Title VII if you've got a legitimate religious exemption. And that's the other thing with this full approval. I think people are going to get fired, and they may not get unemployment for this, right? Because is it a reasonable employment requirement? Probably they're going to say that it is, unless you're claiming religion, as you're out. So, I say always make them walk you to the door, but before it even gets to that, make sure that you've papered your religious exemption. And if they say no, I think at that point it's time to file the EEOC charge before they fire you. Wait the time to file that EEOC charge is between the time they tell you no and the time they fire you. Because if you file that EEOC charge, there's another cause of action you can get in retaliation for, protected activity, which sometimes is easier than the underlying case to make. And now you've teed up the employer for two claims: one for retaliating against you for asserting your rights under Title VII, and the initial Title VII violation under religious freedom. So I'm urging people to do both and get the charges filed between the time that they say no and the time that they fire you.
Yeah, and likewise with a public employer, I think, say if you document your request for an exemption adequately, and especially if it's like religious grounds, and then they fire you, or as you were talking about earlier, if they like segregate you and punish you from the other employees and make you, try to humiliate you or something, like make you wear like 4 masks on your head and try to get people to laugh at you, whatever the case may be. Like, you might have a First Amendment retaliation claim there. That would probably only apply to a public employer, but that might be a whole lot easier than the underlying case.
Right.
Well, I promised you guys I'd let you out by like 6:15. We run over like 10 minutes, but we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Like I said, it's pretty simple. We talked for a long time about it, but I think we're all of the same mind that probably there's no litigation route here. Whether or not they fire you or you quit on your own. There's not going to be any blanket probably litigation route, though it's worth trying if with the right plaintiffs.
Well, let me say this. Let me be clear. I do think that there's a litigation route, and I think it's the religion angle on it. It's the religious exemption in Title VII, and I think that's the only real viable one at this point.
But that's on an individual basis, right? You apply for your religious exemption, the employer denies it to you, and then that individual litigates then against that employer, right?
That's right.
Because we're not talking about a class-wide, religious issue. It's just down to that specific individual.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, Ken has one more question here before we wrap up. Let's see. What protections are there if the government creates an environment in which an employer is required to mandate vaccine? I think what he's getting at there is, at some point, the government's so involved with and intertwined with the employers that can't we trigger civil rights protections against private employers? And I think it's a great argument, but
I think you need more than we've got already. I think you would almost need some sort of direct link, where it's some government compulsion upon the employer, not just sort of the governor on his, I call it the propaganda hour here in Kentucky because our governor's name is Andy, and I call it the propaganda hour when he gets on TV. But it's not just the propaganda hour with the governor encouraging employers to require vaccines. I think you've got to have, you guys know this, in 1983, you need like an intertwining, basically government compulsion kind of situation to trigger that.
Yeah, there is a path to doing that, and I've used it twice that I can recall. But there is a mechanism where you can sue under Section 1983 a private actor, so long as you're alleging and can prove that there was like a conspiracy with a private entity or individual and a government entity or individual. So there is a path to doing that, and I hadn't really thought about that before now. There might be something there. I did that once with a EMS, like an ambulance crew. So you had, I think you had a police excessive force beating situation, and the ambulance crew was there, and the allegations were that they didn't participate, but they kind of, they were there and involved to some extent. And then so I sued them as well, and then come to find out, really, well, they're actually a completely private company. I ended up keeping them in just based on that claim that, look, there's all these state regulations for EMS. The state regulations controls everything about them. And in fact, they have they kind of have supervisory control over them, and it was enough at least to get past a motion to dismiss or something like that. So I mean that's actually a good idea that I haven't thought of. Is there may be some private employers out there who are so intertwined and controlled by the government at every level that there may be enough there to try to make that claim. But this is all, nothing's going to be easier than, if you really want to get out of the vaccine and you really want to keep your job, is going after probably that religious exemption, putting together a fantastic case for a religious exemption and make it so difficult for the employer to refuse that they just move on to someone else.
Yeah, I get the sense even in the hospitals that they really don't want to fire their entire nursing or 30% of their nursing staff. And so I think if people make a colorable argument, I think, in this environment, I think employers are likely to accept it. I mean, but it's got to be a colorable argument, and just understand that, whatever lawyer is looking at that case afterwards is going to want to see a decently written exemption request, so that the claims are well preserved. You put the employer on notice about what your religious beliefs are, why you object to it, and the reasonable accommodations that you're seeking. And I think if you do all those things, I think you're in as good a shoes as anyone to even if you get fired. It's not going to necessarily keep you from getting fired, but at least it'll give guys like us something to work with afterwards.
Yeah, so I saw somebody had asked, do they need a lawyer to go after the religious exemption? And I mean, I think I know the answer to that, but what do you say?
So I'm not doing any assistance on an individualized basis because of the volume. And honestly, folks, generally, if I were to quote a rate, they wouldn't want to pay it anyways. So I'm not doing that. Siri's doing it. He's charging $1,000 for each individualized assistance that he's giving. And I've done it for two people. I did it for my uncle's sister, and I did an individualized one for somebody who is going to be a test case for us. But I can't handle the volume of it. If you guys want to pitch for business, feel free. I'm sure you guys could probably make a pretty good buck on helping people with this right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that most people are just not going to be able to afford it. And I mean, it is something that I mean, if they've done enough research to not want to, to make an informed decision on whether to take the vaccine, I mean, it's not much further down that road to do enough research to put together an adequate religious exemption, application. And it could be different, from between different employers. So I don't think they need a lawyer, but I mean, if they, like you said, the one in New York, it's $1,000 a pop, if they can swing it. So,
yeah.
But certainly if they're going to litigate a denial or something like that, then you never want to go to court without a lawyer, right?
Yeah, I mean, I put a sample out on my law firm Facebook page just to sort of, just like Liberty Counsel did, and to your point, I think the resources are out there. I mean, I don't know if you guys want to quote somebody a price. I mean, I think it's probably well worth it if they think especially if they think their employer is going to double down and they're going to be in court. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even know. I think it might depend on the employer as well in the situation. I mean, that it would be hard to even, if you were going to come up with a flat price to do one of these for somebody, I mean, you'd have to overestimate $1,000, because I mean, some of them could take that much time, whereas many of them may not. But I'll if you don't mind, I'll put the link to the sample letter that you put on your website in the description of this video, where people can kind of get an idea of what it should look like.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know, Andy, you have a meeting to get to, and I'm sure, Chris, you got something to do as well, and I'm sure I have something to do. So it was good talking to you guys again. Hopefully we can do another video here again soon. I appreciate you joining me. And I'll talk to you guys next time.
Thanks, guys.
See you.
Good night.